Section 4, Life with Elder Ephraim the Barrel Maker, continued. The Iconostasis. Elder Ephraim was a superb wood carver. He carved the iconostasis for many churches. When the chapel of the Archangels nearby was renovated, a woodcarver told the elder of that hut that he would charge 20 gold coins to carve a new iconostasis. Since that elder couldn't afford to pay that much, he asked Elder Ephraim to carve it. Elder Ephraim agreed to do the work without discussing the price. When he finished, the elder of that hut gave him only 2 gold coins and asked him, "Is this good enough?" "It's fine," replied Elder Ephraim. As soon as Father Arsenios found out, he was furious. He couldn't bear seeing the extreme injustice and said to Elder Ephraim, "Is that all you got? That's not fair. The other monk asked for 20 coins, and he paid you off with only 2. The simple but wise Elder Ephraim responded, "If we get paid for everything here, my child, what will be left for heaven?" Then Father Arsenios realized that Elder Ephraim was no fool and said to Francis, "He has virtue that is beyond us." Love of ascetics. Whenever the 2 disciples finished their obligations, they had permission to search caves for hermits in order to learn from them. They took full advantage of this permission and combed all the caves and huts in the area. It was during this time that Francis and Father Arsenios began their great ascetical struggles, always with the blessing of their elder. Elder Ephraim saw their great humility and fiery zeal, and he wholeheartedly gave them his blessing to struggle as much as they could and to confess to whichever spiritual father they wanted. Above their little hut was a cave in a very precipitous place. It was so steep that if you slipped there, no one would ever find your bones. That is where Francis did ascetics. He went there with the blessing of Elder Ephraim and remained inside, praying noetically. He sat there for hours and prayed. Other times he would go with Father Arsenios to do ascetics in a place by the sea that they called the Salt Ponds. Once they did ascetics for an entire week. When they returned, Elder Ephraim said to them, "My children, where are you doing your ascetics? Where do you go? Take me along to do ascetics with you." But because of his age, he could barely walk. Only with great difficulty and caution were they able to take the zealous old monk down to the sea to the precipitous cave where they were doing ascetics. They took a fishing rod with them so that they could catch fish to feed him. It was not long before the old monk said to them, "My children, I don't feel so well. Can you take me back up?" As soon as they brought him back, he collapsed out of exhaustion because of his old age. Love of holy books. Even though the young novice Francis was unlettered, he would not stop reading the writings of the Holy Fathers for help and support. Since most of his free time was spent on noetic prayer, he did not devote himself to exhaustive studies. Nevertheless, he kept reading every day because persistent and arduous reading is necessary to understand the subtleties of various thoughts. Naturally, his first choice in reading was Holy Scripture, and especially the New Testament and the Psalms. His mind was so steeped in the concepts found in the Psalms that he wrote his letters with a similar style to that of biblical texts. He also liked reading the lives of the saints, which relaxed the mind, sweeten the heart, enrich one's discernment, and increase one's zeal for greater ascetical feats. He said that the lives of the saints are like a mirror in which one can see one's faults. His disciples remember that no matter what problem that they had, he would always have some beneficial incident from the lives of the saints to tell, which would shed light on their need or on the issue that concerned them. His other favorites were the writings of Abba Dorotheus, the Ladder, and the Evergentinos. As for the Philokalia, he never let it collect dust. He sometimes read the ecclesiastical history, and occasionally the Rudder of St. Nicodemus the Hagurite. He also liked the Way of a Pilgrim, and when he himself became an elder, he highly recommended that people should not just read this book, but also give it to others as a present. Francis found great benefit in the writings and letters of Metropolitan Nectarios of Pentapolis, who would later be canonized a saint. He had first heard about him from Elder Daniel of Catanakia. Later he learned more about him from Elder Hieronymus when he had visited him in Aegina. He had great reverence for Saint Nectarios, even though he had not yet been canonized. One book that he had an inseparable companion throughout his life was the ascetical homilies of St. Isaac the Syrian. He often kept this book beneath his headrest so that it would be one of the first things he would see when he woke up. He had embraced St. Isaac's teaching so much that one can see the entire life of Elder Joseph as a living book of St. Isaac the Syrian. Controversy over the calendar. The two young ascetics continued living in this God-pleasing manner for almost 2 years, far from vain and mundane activities. But suddenly, out of the blue, something unforeseen happened that divided the entire Greek Orthodox people, and even the garden of the Panagia. In 1924, the Church of Greece decided to impose the revised Julian calendar on the liturgical cycle. This innovation split the faithful and created ecclesiastical schisms that still have not healed. Facing this critical moment, the Fathers of the Holy Mountain, after numerous meetings, wisely found the Golden Compromise. They decided to continue using the old calendar, but did not sever their spiritual communion and subordination to the ecumenical patriarchate of Constantinople. Nevertheless, some of the monks of the Holy Mountain were motivated by excessive zeal to disagree with the stance taken by the vast majority of Athonite fathers. The few who disagreed called themselves zealots, and they severed their spiritual communion with the patriarchate and the rest of the Holy Mountain. They would no longer participate in liturgies or meetings with them. Catanakia was one of the more fervent centers for the zealots. Young Francis's brotherhood, due to the ignorance of their elders and their zeal for tradition, was misled and sided with the zealots. Naturally, the young novice followed their lead, but since their stance stemmed from their great love for God, they were not fanatical. And as we shall later see, the course of events persuaded Elder Joseph to return to the Holy Mountain's prudent stance. Tonsure. In the meantime, the two disciples continued to live with sincere servitude and great asceticism besides those good and simple old monks. It was not long before one of them, Elder Joseph, reposed in the Lord. Thus, Elder Ephrem became their sole elder. The exceptional lifestyle of young Francis convinced Elder Ephrem that this fighter could officially be enrolled in the angelic order of monasticism. Since they were zealots, the council of elders of the Great Lavra hesitated for a long time before giving their permission for his tonsure. Furthermore, the brotherhood of Elder Daniel of Catanakia spread rumors that Francis was deluded. In the end, though, the impeccable conduct of his brotherhood silenced their doubts. Thus, the day of his second baptism was set for Sunday, August 31st, 1925, the commemoration of the deposition of the precious sash of the Theotokos. Francis was tonsured with the name Joseph, Yosef, that is, he received the name of his departed elder. He was 27 years old. His tonsure took place in the cave of St. Athanasios in a compunctious atmosphere with a flood of tears. The priest was the spiritual father Euthymios, who lived there in a cave. Love for the Theotokos. All Athonite fathers are known for their deep faith, reverence, and love toward the most holy Theotokos. She has promised to be the abbess, protectress, purveyor, and mother of all Athonite monks, and this is why they, too, love her very much. Elder Joseph's love for her, however, even from his years as a novice, was unparalleled. There were no words to describe the faith, love, and reverence he had for the Panagia. There was no problem, temptation, or issue that he would not entrust to the Theotokos with absolute faith. He would never undertake anything without having previously prayed fervently to her because he had experienced her help so many times. For this reason he would burst into tears when merely thinking of her. He preferred to go to chapels alone, because whenever he saw an icon of the Theotokos, he would fall before her and kiss her icon with streams of tears. Often hours would pass as he knelt and wept torrents of tears. It may be said that as a sweet reward for this devotion, she counted him worthy to depart this world on the day of her own dormition. Love for his family. In the meantime, not only the calendar issue, but also the great ethnic catastrophe in Asia Minor had shaken all of Greece at its foundation. Furthermore, the entire planet was in turmoil, with revolutions and massacres. It was as if hell had opened its mouth to devour the whole world. Father Joseph was concerned for the spiritual well-being of his relatives and prayed fervently for his entire family. One day after praying, he knelt to relax a little, and suddenly he beheld before him a fiery young man. His form resembled that of a human, but he radiated a blinding light not of this world. On either side of him, this angel held two little girls in his arms. They were Father Joseph's little sisters who had died young, Maruso and Ergina. The angel turned to each one of them and said, "This is your brother. Do you recognize him?" The taller girl answered, "I recognize him, but many years have passed since I saw him." The shorter one replied, "I did not see him when I was alive." Then the angel said to them, "Embrace him, and then we shall leave." His two little sisters embraced him very sweetly, and the entire place was filled with an indescribable fragrance, as if he were in a fragrant field of flowers. And then they departed. Soon after this, Father Joseph's mother, who was full of concern and apprehension regarding the numerous calamities, wrote to her son seeking his advice. He in turn, moved by love, and with his elder's blessing, replied. It was the first time since he had left home that he had written to his relatives. His letter began as follows. My beloved mother and all my brothers, relatives, and friends, rejoice in the Lord, all of you. I yearned, and my soul was aflame to hear about your spiritual and bodily health. But the commandment of the Lord says, He that loveth father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, forces me to forget not only parents, brothers, and relatives, but even my very own body. All my soul's eros and love yearns to be turned henceforth towards God. Upon him does it want to gaze and behold, to pray, to seek, to receive the appropriate medicines for the cleansing of the heart and the development of the spiritual man. But now, seeing the tremendous calamity that has befallen the world, and fearing lest the danger of impiety reaches you as well, and fearing that I am wasting the constant vigils that I do for you, I was compelled to resort to the maxim, necessity overrides law. And I said, may I transgress one commandment so that I might win my beloved ones. My desire, the burning of my heart, the divine eros that continuously kindles my emotions, is how to save souls. How rational sacrifices can be offered to our sweetest Jesus. His letters, full of divine wisdom and unutterable and immeasurable love, stirred his relatives' souls. It was the first time they had heard words with such beauty, wisdom, and depth. Even though his letters were replete with spelling mistakes, they reflected all the sweetness and love of his heart. The results were immediate. All the members of his family read and reread his letters with rivers of tears. His mother even began to desire to become a nun. The three angels. As we have already mentioned, there was a large cave and a steep slope above the cell of the Annunciation, where Father Yosef and Father Arsenios lived. A little higher up, in a more remote location, Father Joseph made an artificial cave on a rock using wooden planks. This room was so small that he could barely fit inside. It was like a box, about 4 feet on each side. This is where the young Father Joseph went in order to struggle more with the prayer, which is something that requires stillness. Following the schedule that he had received from Elder Daniel, he would go to this cave immediately after sunset, and for 6 hours he would occupy himself with noetic prayer and tears without ceasing. Once, on Epiphany, a vigil was going to be held in Katonakia. Father Joseph usually did not go to vigils and feast days. He avoided them because he kept a certain austerity, not as a recluse, but as a solitary hermit. That evening in his tiny cave, he began to occupy himself with Noetic prayer. Around midnight, his little room suddenly filled with an extremely bright light that was quite different from the light of the day that we see. The intensity of this light increased so much that he went out of himself and felt as if he had no body. At the same time, 3 little children who were no more than 10 years old appeared before him. They all had the same stature, the same figure, the same clothing, and the same face in terms of their beauty. They were angels of the Lord representing the Holy Trinity. Father Joseph gazed at them in ecstasy and wonder. They were so close to each other that they were touching, and the 3 of them blessed simultaneously in the same way that a priest blessed. They went back and forth while melodically singing, "As many of you have been baptized into Christ," as they approached him, and "have put on Christ, Alleluia," as they withdrew without turning around. They did this 3 times. Father Joseph was wondering, how did the children so small learn to chant and bless so beautifully? It didn't cross his mind that on the Holy Mountain there are no such children that are so small and beautiful. When he later asked what he was thinking about during times like this, he answered that there are no thoughts when the noose is held captive in theoria, because it is suffused with light by divine grace and does not have any activity of his own. He merely felt that he was in a thrice blessed state. Section 4, Continued Life with Elder Ephraim the Barrel Maker. The move to St. Basil's Skeet. Difficulties in Katonachia. After that vision of the 3 angels, the grace of the prayer became more abundant, and his yearning for stillness increased even more. His mind did not occupy itself with anything earthly. At the same time, however, the trials of Father Joseph and Father Arsenios also multiplied, and they could not bear the problems they encountered there in Katonachia. The other fathers nearby would constantly send them out to do chores that would ruin their schedule and impede their hesychistic life. Elder Ephraim was a simple man, and even though he did not like what was happening, he was too timid to refuse their requests. So he would send his young disciples wherever the neighboring fathers wanted. Another problem that ruined their stillness was the old habit that all the fathers had of taking a shortcut through the courtyard of their hut whenever they wanted to go to the center of Katonachia. Furthermore, whenever a feast day was approaching, they had to join in on the tasks done by everyone. Father Joseph was patient with this situation for 7 whole years, but after the vision of the 3 angels, he could not endure the distractions any longer. His heart was on fire for seclusion and stillness. In addition to all that, their handicraft of making barrels was such a burden. Unfortunately, everybody remembered at the last minute before harvesting that they needed their barrels repaired. Since Elder Ephraim was excellent at fixing them, everyone ran to him. This meant that the neighboring fathers' work fell on him all at once, and they pressured him to finish as soon as possible because they needed them immediately. Out of his well-known sense of humor, he would not refuse. However, he nearly suffered exhaustion because he was forced to work day and night. In addition, he never asked to be paid for his work. For this reason, many took advantage of his kindness and gave him a trifling sum for his labor. But things had gotten out of hand. Even laymen were taking advantage of him. For labor worth 1,000 drachmas, people would give him 50 or 100 drachmas, and ask him brazenly, "Is that enough, Father Ephraim?" It is enough, my child," he would reply timidly. Naturally, his young disciples could not bear to see their elder working himself to death day and night, especially when it was at the expense of fulfilling his monastic duties, while others took advantage of him. For all these reasons, they started to consider moving to a quieter place. So one day, Father Joseph called Father Arsenios and said to him, "This work of ours not only ruins our stillness, but it also makes our elder run the risk of exhaustion. Let's pray about it first, Father Arsenios, and then let's ask him if he will agree to the idea of moving to a quieter place. Indeed, this is what they did. After praying about it, they proposed their idea to Elder Ephraim, and he was so happy that he felt as if God himself had provided a solution. With great joy he accepted the proposal, and he exhorted them to search for a quieter area. At St. Basil's Skeet. For their new place of ascetics, Father Joseph and Father Arsenios decided to choose the most secluded and deserted place on Athos so that they could cultivate the prayer without distractions. They chose St. Basil's Skeet. Indeed, the place was exceptional, with deep stillness. The skeet can hardly be seen at all from anywhere. If a person did not know the paths well, he would not be able to find it easily. All in all, there were only 8 huts in the skeet then, and they were rather far apart from one another. It was as if the neighbors, who were also Hesychists, did not exist at all. At that time the following fathers lived there: Elder Cherubim, who had reached lofty levels of poverty and silence; Papa Gerasimos, with his disciple Father Maximos, who followed the line of the Colavadis unswervingly; Father Gerasimos Menagius, the educated chemist, who abandoned everything out of his love for God; Elder Theophylactos, who lived in harmony with the wild animals, as did Adam before the fall; and the 2 Romanians, Elder Jonas and his disciple Papa Makarios. All of these fathers lived hesychistically, with intentional silence. In fact, they inspired so much reverence in others that when visitors passed through the skeet they would be especially quiet, so that they would not disturb the ascetics. Their dwelling. Since there were no empty huts, Father Joseph and Father Arsenios were forced to build some makeshift huts on their own. This may sound easy, but in practice it was extremely difficult because they lacked even the most basic construction materials. How could they haul construction material up to that distant, isolated, abrupt slopes? They didn't even have water to make mortar. Their little cistern had so little water that it barely provided enough for them to drink. This is why they were forced to gather the leftover water from washing dishes or clothes in order to make mortar. They built their cells far apart from each other for greater stillness. They made them out of primitive bricks and straw, using mud for mortar and sheet metal to cover the roof. The cells were like chicken coops, but the view was exceptional. Their chapel, also covered with sheet metal, was dedicated to St. John the Forerunner. They also built another little shack set apart so that they would have another place for praying all night in stillness. Elder Sophrony of Essex visited them there, and he described their living arrangement as follows. Their hut was extremely isolated from the other hermits so that they would have greater stillness. It was built with large rocks and had very tiny, narrow rooms. That evening Elder Joseph let me sleep in a stone sack, the room of his brother Athanasios. Its dimensions were about 3 feet by 5 feet. I have a small body and managed to sleep on a tiny bed, and there, by stretching out my legs and resting my feet on a box that was in a hole in the wall. In the morning Elder Joseph led me to a slope facing the sea, quite far from their common hut, where he had built a tiny hut for himself for more stillness. It was barely large enough for him to stretch out his feet inside. It had only one window, which he also used as a door. As soon as they finished building the bare necessities in mid-1928, they left their hut in Katanakia. They donated their hut along with its chapel to a neighboring monk and asked that he remember them in his prayers. They left most of their belongings behind so that their lack of possessions would help them achieve their goal. They only brought with them a few books and some clothes, only whatever they could carry. They seated their elder on a donkey and then set off. This is how simply they set out for the wilderness of Mount Athos. At St. Basil's Skeet, they began to live a very austere life. They did not make artistic handicrafts, so that their minds would not be distracted from prayer. In order not to remain idle and become a burden to others, they made brooms out of shrubs. They gave them to various monasteries and received rusks in return. Since it was very difficult to haul food up there, they planted a little garden in order to have some vegetables. They named it Eden. It failed, however, due to the rocky soil and lack of water. Rejuvenation. Elder Ephraim seemed rejuvenated, having been freed from the heavy labor he had been doing. So he put all the emphasis on spiritual work, saying the Jesus prayer with a prayer rope, doing prostrations, and keeping vigil. But he was old and couldn't do as many prayer ropes as he did when he was young. At this time the monk, Father Matthew Karpathakis, also lived at St. Basil's Skeet. He would later become the leader of the most fanatical group of the Old Calendar zealots, the Matthewites. Whenever the fathers gathered for their meetings without being asked, he would go up to the pulpit and stir up the ascetics by preaching against the new calendar. One day Father Matthew said in his sermon, "Brethren, the days have been shortened," referring to Christ's prophecy of the end times. When Elder Ephraim returned to his hut, he said with simplicity, "Bravo to Father Matthew. Today he solved the mystery. No wonder I couldn't do as many prayer ropes as I used to. The days have been shortened." "No, Yeronda," Father Arsenios replied with even greater simplicity. "You've gotten weak, and you sleep more." "No, Father Matthew said so. The nights have been shortened," the little old monk insisted. The repose of Elder Ephraim. Due to the austerity of conditions there, Elder Ephraim did not live long in that new ascetical arena. It wasn't just his age, but also his excessive sense of obligation that wouldn't let him reduce his monastic duties. He was counted worthy of foreseeing his departure, and so he prepared himself accordingly. When Elder Ephraim was about to die, Father Joseph asked him, "How do you feel now that you will depart from this life? Do you have the conviction that you will be saved?" "Oh, my child, what could I expect to feel? My wife and my children will all go to the right, and I will go to the left." "But Yeronda, how can you say that after laboring so much?" "No, I will go to the left because I am a great sinner who didn't do the will of God. All of you do the will of God. I'm the only one who doesn't." He honestly believed what he said. He had acquired the genuine fruit of monastic life, holy humility. Father Joseph, who was very sharp in spiritual matters, realized from his words that God wanted to preserve him at the end of his life from vainglory and pride, which could lead him to perdition, by making him feel very sinful. The labor of the monastic life had established humility and self-reproach in this simple and sanctified little old man. Nothing could shake that foundation. On the night before his repose, Elder Ephraim heard a voice saying his name. "Elder Ephraim! Elder Ephraim!" He interrupted it with the simplicity of a child and said, "It was my guardian angel calling for me." The following day he passed away peacefully. When Elder Joseph and Elder Ephraim reposed, their two disciples inherited their blessing as a protection and purveyance. Thus, at the age of 31, Father Joseph became a normal elder in the manner that Elder Daniel of Katanakia had advised him. A few days after the repose of Elder Ephraim, Father Arsenios saw him in a vision when he was praying. He described his vision as follows. Elder Ephraim was in the most delightful place. His face shone gloriously, and he stood beside a beautiful little church. I was glad to see him in so much glory, and asked him, "Yeronda, what is that beautiful little church?" "Ah, that is mine. Remember when I carved that iconostasis for only 2 gold coins? Since I didn't get paid then, and since I didn't complain or judge him, Christ kept it for me in heaven. Remember what I told you?" Section 5. The Formation of a Sisterhood. first encounters, Athens and Aegina. Not long after the repose of Elder Ephrem, which occurred in 1929, the young Elder Joseph departed from the Holy Mountain with Father Arsenios. It was the first time after almost 10 years. He went to Athens in order to have his mother tonsured a nun and to be her sponsor. At that time his mother was 58 years old. When she was tonsured and received the angelic great schema, she was given the name Agathangeli. She passed away 8 years later. When Elder Joseph visited her, she was living with her beloved grandson Leonardo. He was amazed to hear Elder Joseph's words, which were so full of grace. He was also surprised to see that Elder Joseph would not speak about spiritual matters at all to people who were not interested in spirituality. Since the picturesque island of Aegina was so close to Athens, Elder Joseph and Father Arsenios seized the opportunity to visit Father Arsenios' sister, the nun Ephraxia, who was there serving Elder Hieronymus. The two siblings had not seen each other since 1918 when Father Arsenios left the Holy Land. Father Hieronymus, who was then 46, was an experienced worker of virtue and prayer and could speak comfortably about high spiritual states. The good sister Ephraxia was enraptured by what she heard from the sanctified mouth of Elder Joseph because he was so advanced. The personal meeting of the two elders, Joseph and Hieronymus, inspired Elder Hieronymus to turn systematically to Hesychasm with much fire. From then on he had great reverence for Elder Joseph. Since they were already out in the world, Elder Joseph and Father Arsenios also passed through northern Greece, and in Drama met a few of Father Arsenios' relatives from Anatolia. Among them were his brother Leonidas Galanopoulos and his nephew Harlambos, who had fled to Drama around 1922. Leonidas was seeing his brother for the first time in 19 whole years, since he had set off for Jerusalem on foot in 1910. Leonidas had bid farewell to a 24-year-old lad, and now he saw before him a 43-year-old venerable monk with a graying beard. Father Arsenios' nephew and godson Harlambos was about 19 years old, and the presence of the two monks was perhaps decisive in his turn towards God. Pious women from Asia Minor. After leaving Drama, Elder Joseph visited some people in Thessaloniki who corresponded with him. There he met some very pious widows who had been uprooted from Asia Minor, whose only consolation for their incredible suffering was prayer. They had lost their husbands to the Ataturk battalions. They expressed their pain to Christ day and night, and to him did they entrust their hopes. All day long they lamented, Zakli Isu, sweet Jesus, and had already begun to taste the very sweet fruits of prayer. Seeing their great struggle for prayer and their love for Christ, Elder Joseph decided to help them by sending them letters from Mount Athos to guide them in the work of noetic prayer. He also became acquainted with a nun, Sister Theodosio, or Rachel K., who was also from Asia Minor. She received his advice with tremendous faith and found great benefit from his letters. In fact, she revered him so much that when she departed this life in 1979, a photograph of Elder Joseph from 1930 was found in her cell. Searching for a new elder. Elder Joseph and Father Arsenios did not remain for long outside of the Holy Mountain. When they returned, they were hit by two life-changing events. On September 8, 1929, Elder Daniel of Katonakia, who had helped them in the beginning, reposed in the Lord. Soon after this, in the same year, Elder Daniel the Hesychas, who was their spiritual guide and had given them their daily program, also departed. Elder Joseph wept very much those days because he knew what a great misfortune it was to lose the only spiritual support he had. Being deprived of this support, Elder Joseph devoted himself to noetic prayer with great ardor from that time on. He constantly found ways to increase his intense ascetical struggles in order to enrich and preserve the grace of God, because he never took it for granted. His spiritual thirst was so unquenchable that he said, "If I knew of someone here, some ascetic who could teach me a virtue that I haven't cultivated, I would eagerly go and listen to him." Elder Joseph had experienced the value and the reward of obedience. Therefore, after the repose of their elders, he and Father Arsenios were considering submitting themselves in obedience to another excellent elder. But in the same year that elder also departed. What could they do? They finally decided to live together in a hut and become disciples of their spiritual guide's successor, Father Anthony. They had assumed that he would be continuing the spiritual heritage of his elder, if not at the same level, then just slightly lower. When they went there, Elder Joseph saw that he had not inherited anything from his blessed elder. After all, it isn't sufficient merely to find an elder and to live deep in the wilderness with him. One must have absolute spiritual obedience to inherit the grace of one's elder. So Elder Joseph and Father Arsenio decided to leave and continue their search elsewhere for holy monks from whom they could benefit. That is why these young ascetics did not stay in one place, but began circling the holy mountain in search of spiritual edification. Thus, from the end of autumn 1929 until the middle of 1930, they wandered about without possessions or a place to stay, like the shepherds of old. Step by step, they searched all the huts, all the caves, all the ravines of the holy mountain in their attempt to find as many crumbs of the Hesychistic tradition as they could. The truth is that the old good leaven had almost completely disappeared, which is why Elder Joseph was very sorrowful. Of course, there were plenty of monks who were strugglers, but they lacked the gift of guiding others in the science of spiritual watchfulness, nipsis. Nevertheless, despite the disappointments, Elder Joseph did not stop seeking and hoping to find some experienced spiritual father. He had already tasted the grace of the perfect, but what he was looking for was someone who could teach him how to preserve it and explain to him the mystery of how God disciplines us. For a year and a half they wandered around the holy mountain in order to be benefited by some wise monk or to live ascetically in places where some saints had lived in the past. They went to the ascetical dwellings of St. Maximus Kafsokalisis, St. Peter the Athonite, and St. Nilos the Myrrh-streaming, as well as to wherever they heard that there were caves in which saints had lived. They spent that entire summer in those caves. Once they went to a peak named Mount Carmel by the Athonites, which was like a tall pyramid. They lived ascetically there at the summit of Mount Carmel for a while. For the most part, however, they remained in the area of the Great Lavra or around the summit of Mount Athos. Once they went to a cave near Provada where St. Gregory Palamas had lived. They were considering living there because Elder Joseph was a worker of noetic prayer and hoped that by living in the place where great watchful fathers had lived, he would elicit their compassion. Persecution. One day after their lengthy vigil, they were tired, and so they rested. After resting, Elder Joseph got up and continued his vigil. In the meantime, Father Arsenios went somewhere and returned after a few hours. As he drew near, he heard voices swearing crudely and shouting, "You burned us! You burned us!" Being scared, he ran to Elder Joseph in his usual simple manner and asked him, "Who did you burn?" "Those are the demons," Elder Joseph answered. "I see them and hear them, but don't be afraid, they'll leave. They are upset about our vigil and our noetic prayer." After completing his vigil, Elder Joseph slept a little in the morning. In his sleep he saw pigs entering the Great Lavra, which was then an idiorhythmic monastery. He said to Father Arsenios, "The demons have entered the Great Lavra." And he told him what he had seen in his sleep. Prepare yourselves for trials and suffering. Indeed, later that morning, some monks from the great Lavra came and said, "Get out of here, you deluded people." And they chased Elder Joseph and Father Arsenios away. Winter hardships. Elder Joseph and Father Arsenios owned only a few items. Each of them had a thick cape that he had received as a blessing from some Russian monks. With the capes, they covered themselves in winter and also used them as mattresses to sleep on. They also had a small sack for their rusks and a small copper pot for boiling any wild greens or bulbs they might find. When they didn't have any water, they lit a fire and melted snow in their pot. They always kept those items with them, even when they climbed Mount Athos. In winter, due to the severity of the cold, they went and stayed in their poor little huts at St. Basil's Skeet. As soon as Pascha had passed, they renewed their search for holy ascetics from cave to cave until October. By being constantly on the move and by avoiding unnecessary encounters, they managed to remain unknown to most people. In those days, around 1930, there were 6,000 monks on the holy mountain, which made it easy for them to disappear in the multitude. They continued the program of keeping vigil all night long with noetic prayer and resting in the morning hours. Elder Joseph and Father Arsenios were acquainted with the abbot of the holy monastery of Caracallu, Elder Kodratos, of blessed memory, who lived from 1859 to 1940. He was a cordial man of prayer, full of affection and love for the poor and the hermits. He wouldn't let anyone leave his monastery empty-handed. When Elder Joseph and Father Arsenios went to his monastery barefoot and in rags, he welcomed them full of joy, love, and reverence, and he gave them whatever they needed. St. Silouan. Father Arsenios was simple-minded by nature, but he applied obedience with incredible tact and precision. The following incident is characteristic of his courtesy. While they were wandering around the holy mountain in search of holy ascetics, they heard about an exceptional ascetic at the Russian monastery of St. Panteleimon, Father Silouanos, known to us today as St. Silouan the Athonite. Elder Joseph asked Father Arsenios, "What do you say? Should we go and see this ascetic?" Father Arsenios, however, declined politely. The reason was because he spoke Russian fluently since he'd grown up in Russia, whereas Elder Joseph did not. Father Arsenios did not feel comfortable with the idea of talking while his elder listened, so they did not go. What an amazing, gentle worker of obedience. Nevertheless, St. Silouan's disciple, Elder Sophrony, heard about Elder Joseph and found him on his own. Elder Sophrony visited him frequently because he had great reverence for him. He later said that Elder Joseph was one of the greatest ascetics of the holy mountain he had ever met. In a letter of his, Elder Sophrony wrote the following about their meeting. "I wanted to hear the words of this bearer of great grace. He spoke to me primarily about the hesychistic life of a hermit, and that he himself had seen the uncreated light several times. My discussion with Yerunda left a deep impression on me. I had the impression that I had in front of me a spiritual general. Indeed, he was the teacher, which is what pious monks of the wilderness of the holy mountain would call him out of reverence and respect." The 12 invisible ascetics. According to Athonite tradition, there is a group of 12 holy ascetics who are hidden from everyone, lack every human consolation, and appear only to whoever they want. They have delivered themselves entirely to God's providence, and unceasing prayer is their sole occupation. Because of their great self-denial, they do not even have clothes to wear. When someone in their group passes away, they choose the most virtuous monk of the holy mountain to take his place. Elder Joseph and Father Arsenios searched to find those ascetics in order to receive heavenly benefit and unerring guidance, but they couldn't find them. Later they learned that those ascetics had been going to Papakosmas for years to receive Holy Communion every Saturday. They made him promise not to tell anyone about them. Once at a feast day, Papakosmas let this secret slip out, and he revealed this great incident to the other fathers. The following Saturday, after the invisible ascetics received communion, they told him, "Since you revealed us, you won't see us again." He fell at their feet, begged forgiveness, but they responded, "May you be forgiven, but you still won't see us again." Papakosmas wept for many days, but never again did he see them. The formation of a sisterhood continued. Second visit to the world, establishing a convent. The pious widows of Thessaloniki began to taste the sweet fruits of prayer and the desired the holy angelic schema of monasticism. Yeranda's letters to them were simple and unaffected, but full of wisdom and much love. In one of them he wrote, "You ask, O child of our God, if the Lord wants you to receive the holy schema. My sister, from the time you first saw the world, you have walked along the path of God, and you never sought anything but the will of the Lord. So do not doubt that it is time to wear the holy schema, since even without the schema you are a nun. Now that you have grown old, what kind of works do you seek?" In 1930, in order to help the widows, Elder Joseph decided to gather them together and to stay with them for a little while. He was granted permission to use an empty monastery in the deserted village Gerovica, which is near Zyronovo of Drama. The monastery had been destroyed and was nearly in ruins, so he asked his brother Leonardo from Athens to come help with the reconstruction. There in Gerovica, he tonsured 5 nuns: Theodora, who was a sanctified soul, whom he appointed as the abbess; Ephraxia, who became the abbess after the repose of Theodora; another Ephraxia, crying Mary, who always wept out of great compunction; and Fevronia. Yeranda's nuns were very virtuous souls and were all from Asia Minor. He taught them how to keep vigil at night with noetic prayer. They kept vigil on their knees and spoke to Christ with much lamentation. Each one had her own little cell. When Yeranda went with his prayer rope to visit them and see if they were keeping vigil, they had so much compunction and wailing that they didn't even notice him. Sister Theodora had a strong spiritual connection with Elder Joseph. He himself mentioned in one of his letters that he could feel her breath even when she was miles away. In other words, when he was on the holy mountain praying, suddenly his sense of location disappeared, since grace is not limited by place nor time, and he felt that she was beside him even though she was out in the world. Sister Ephraxia, a holy nun. Among the widows whom Yeranda tonsured was one exceptional, holy little soul, Sister Ephraxia. When she was still a laywoman in Thessaloniki, and Papu Yosif and Father Arsenios were in drama, she told her friends, "I saw an elder who had such and such a face, and he will make me a nun." "Don't be so silly," they said to her. "Do you believe in dreams?" "I can't explain it, but that's what I saw." Indeed, when Yeranda arrived in Thessaloniki, they met by a divine coincidence, and in the end he tonsured her with the name Ephraxia. But since she was from Asia Minor, she didn't know Greek well, and when asked her name, she replied, Epraxia. After becoming a nun, she still read the Psalter in Turkish. When she read the great Horologion and other ecclesiastical books in Greek, she couldn't understand them. For this reason, she wept constantly and begged God to enlighten her to understand what she was reading. One night, after shedding rivers of tears, She saw St. John the theologian in her sleep, who gave her something to drink with a little spoon. When she woke up, she realized that she could read anything and completely understand it. Immediately she grabbed the great horologion and read it and understood everything. Eurondice Ephraxia was very ascetical, but her highest virtue was that she had great faith in Yeronda. No matter what he said to her, she always received it as if it were a divine revelation. In fact, she would frequently have the following charming dialogue with him. Before beginning her vigil, she would go to Yeronda and tell him, "Yeronda, say that I will have prayer tonight." "Go on, you will have prayer." "Not like that, Yeronda. You didn't say it with all your heart." Say it," she told him again. "All right, you will have a torrent of prayer." Good, thank you, Yeronda." The amazing thing is that God fulfilled whatever he said. She did indeed have a torrent of grace then. She had so much faith in her elder that she said to him, "If I could only take you with me on my shoulders, then I would fear nothing. I would even go to Jerusalem on foot like that." Since she had this kind of faith in her elder, she achieved many things in prayer. She did prayer of the heart for hours and reached great dispassion and a high spiritual state. Sometimes when Yeronda would enter her cell, he would have to nudge her to make her recover. In other words, she was in the initial stages of theoria. She must have had visions as well. She was, of course, at all times a good-natured person, casting out a demon. Once a child came to the monastery's church during the Divine Liturgy. After the liturgy, the child approached the priest and begged him to read a prayer and to bless him with the sign of the cross because he was possessed. The priest said to the child, "My child, go to that nun and ask her to bless you with the sign of the cross. She has the power to make you well." So the child did as he was told, and he went over to her and begged her to bless him. "My child," she replied, "go to the priest. He's the one with the grace and the power. I'm just a simple nun. But he sent me over here for you to make the sign of the cross over me. Please bless me, sister. Is it so hard?" The good old nun found herself in a difficult spot. But what else could she do with the child insisting? So she made the sign of the cross over him, and immediately the demon left him. From then on, the child was completely healthy. Yeronda's strictness. Sister Ephraxia later recalled, "Elder Joseph was extremely strict. Whenever we went to work at an orchard to gather cherries, he wouldn't let us eat any. Yeronda was very strict back then. There were many fruits that had fallen from our fruit trees, but for the sake of ascesis, Yeronda wouldn't let us eat them. We usually ate only onions, boiled potatoes, and rusks. Sister Favronia was young and worked hard. Because of this, she felt the need to eat a little extra. But Sister Ephraxia, who was the abbess after the repose of Theodora, was very strict. Since she herself was a great ascetic, she had high standards for the nuns for whom she was responsible, so she constantly scolded Sister Favronia, "Don't eat so much." Poor Sister Favronia would just lower her head and blush out of embarrassment. Once Yeronda was present when she scolded her, and he said to Sister Ephraxia, "Let the girl eat, she's hungry. She's a glutton." Yeronda then said to Sister Ephraxia, "Stop talking." "But she's always trying to eat more." When Yeronda left, Sister Ephraxia started scolding her again. She did have difficulty controlling her tongue in the beginning. Yeronda, however, was like a general who always knew the best strategy. So he told her, "Listen well. If you speak one more time while we're eating, I'm going to throw the food in the pan out the window." As soon as they sat down to eat, Yeronda said, Ephraxia, be careful. Euronymous Ephraxia realized that he meant business, so she was quiet for a while. But she couldn't hold it in for good, and she slipped and said, "Look, Favronia, don't eat so much." Then Yerunda took the food and the pan and threw them out the window into the dirt. "Go ahead. Now you're going to gather it up and eat it along with the dirt to learn your lesson." Her Holiness. Because she accepted all of Yerunda's strict training with humility, she not only corrected herself, but even became holy. Even her clothes were fragrant like myrrh. Once her belt broke, and when she gave it to Father Arsenios to mend, it was fragrant. This is the kind of ascetic she was. Papa Ephrem of Katanakia knew from his own experience how much grace these pious old nuns had. He once told the following story about Sister Ephraxia. After Papu Yosif and I became acquainted, he told his nuns that he had found a good young priest, referring to me. So Euronymous Ephraxia and the other nuns decided to knit a scufo for me. When he came back, he approached me and said, "Wear this scufo." As soon as I had put it on, immediately I received grace and active prayer. I was aflame with prayer and divine eros. "What kind of scufo is this, Yerunda?" I asked with amazement. If you only knew," he replied, "how much Eurondisa prayed and wept while knitting this scufo. Things like this are treasures." These holy souls passed their entire lives with great asceticism and prayer. They were real gems. The last of these 5 nuns to die was Sister Ephraxia, who lived about 100 years. When she saw the demons that came to try to take her soul, she turned to the left and said, "Git, git," which means go away in Turkish. In this way she chased away the demons with her eyes open and in her right mind. Then she turned to the right and said to the angels she saw, "Gel, gel," which means come. This is how the last nun of Elder Joseph passed away. Difficulties. Faith versus medicine. Yerunda always struggled hard. He didn't know what it meant to retreat in battle. He always had great faith, proportional to his works and struggles. He used to say, "Proceed with faith, not by means of rational knowledge. Do all your works with faith, trusting in God. What is important is not what rational knowledge dictates, but what faith dictates." A nun once wrote to Yerunda that she was ill and would die if she did not have an operation. But since the illness was gynecological, he didn't want her to have the operation, since all surgeons were male. So he prayed intensely for her. While he was praying, God enlightened him that the illness would pass. Bearing this in mind, he wrote to her the exact opposite of what the doctor was telling her, that she would live without having an operation. She wrote back to him that the doctor warned her that she would die without the operation. Nevertheless, Yerunda repeated, "Have faith, leave it all to God, prefer death." Later, the nun replied that her illness went away. At first, Yerunda was inflexible in his stance against doctors and medicines. Near the end of his life, however, he yielded to the entreaties of his disciples to accept medical treatment. And he realized the benefit of medicines. He explained his change of heart as follows. "Many people have come to me, and with prayer and fasting they were healed. But now the Lord doesn't hear me, so that I learn about medicines and doctors and be lenient with others. I also read the letters of St. Nectarios, and I saw how much he, such a great saint, paid attention to the doctors and medicines. I am just a poor ascetic who has grown old in the wilderness, and I wanted to heal only through faith. But now I too am learning that both medicines and grace are necessary." Obedience is greater than asceticism. Once he visited another women's monastery near Drama. Since it was late, he stayed overnight in their guest quarters. The nuns who took care of the guest quarters noticed that they found his bed exactly as they had the previous night. For the sake of asceticism, Yerunda and Father Arsenios wouldn't sleep lying down or even in bed. But when the abbess of the monastery found out about this, she called him and said, "Do you know how to be obedient, Yerunda?" "Yes." "All right then, from now on you will lie down on a bed when you rest." Yerunda had a little difficulty giving up his ascetics, but he decided to be obedient. For the first time in years he slept in a bed. And what happened? When he awoke for his vigil, he had so much clarity of mind and rest of soul that he was amazed at the power of obedience. That night he also found great benefit in his vigil. Afterwards he said to Father Arsenios, "From now on we will sleep on wooden beds." A clairvoyant nun. Yerunda's life and drama in no way differed from his life on the Holy Mountain. He lived with endless perfection as his goal. This is why whenever he heard about someone advanced in virtue, he would immediately rush to meet him to be benefited. While he was in drama, some people told him, "There's a nun in drama who has the gift of prophecy and solves all problems." "I will go and see her," Yerunda replied. This nun supposedly spoke with the Panagia, and the Panagia would enlighten her to make prophecies about everything, even about the people who would visit her. This is why many people went to her. When Yerunda went to her, he asked her, "How did you receive this grace?" "It is from God." "From the Holy Spirit," she replied. "Are you able to read thoughts?" "Yes." "I will put a thought in my heart, and if you can tell me what it is, fine. If not, may you become mute." Yerunda put in his mind an insult against the devil because he could tell that it was the devil who was enlightening her. "Tell me what my thought is." But she was mute. She couldn't talk. "Speak up," he said. Silence. Then he said to her, "If you repent and agree to stop making prophecies with the devil's help, I will make the sign of the cross over you, and you will get well." She agreed by nodding, and then Yerunda made the sign of the cross over her, and her tongue was freed. He told her, "You are in delusion because of your pride and high-mindedness. Pay attention to your sins and don't do this again." Unfortunately, after a while, the nun returned to her delusion. Persecution. The local bishop rejoiced with the establishment of a women's monastery by Elder Joseph because the bishop was a spiritual man. With the Orthodox mindset for which he was known, he believed firmly that functioning monasteries would bring great benefit to his flock. There were, however, some people who were not fond of Yerunda. They slandered him very badly to the bishop for supposedly doing unethical deeds, just as others had slandered St. Nectarios. God allowed the bishop to be misled. He believed the accusations without examining them and began to persecute Yerunda and hinder his work. Yerunda understood the pious bishop's position. To put an end to the matter, he hid in one of his friend's houses. He found a quiet corner there and practiced stillness as if he were in a cave. He was very worried, however, because he didn't know what was happening to his nuns and if they had been driven away or not. While he was worrying about that, a worse trial occurred. He found out the partisan soldiers went to the monastery where his nuns were. Out of his great concern and pain, he prayed hard all day. By nightfall he was exhausted by praying so long in agony. As he was half asleep, he saw St. Nicholas, to whom his monastery was dedicated, say to him, "Don't worry, I have your nuns under my protection." He immediately woke up and felt consoled, even though his fear and agony had not yet completely disappeared. Soon after this, since he was still exhausted, he fell asleep. As soon as he was in a deep sleep, the Panagia appeared to him and embraced him. Her clothes exuded an indescribable fragrance. Then Yerunda found himself in a state of inexpressible bliss. His fear and agony had disappeared completely, and for months he could smell that unearthly fragrance of the Most Holy Theotokos. Later he found out that when the soldiers tried to enter the monastery to harm the nuns, they couldn't see the entrance. The Panagia had made both doors invisible to their eyes. So they kept going around the monastery's walls while swearing at the nuns for building a monastery with no entrance. Finally they gave up and left. Revelation and prayer. One day near the end of 1931, as he was praying in his quiet corner, he suddenly cried out in agony, "Nicholas!" Nicholas was his brother, 10 years younger than he. With the financial aid of Francis and other relatives, he had managed to go to school. He had gone to graduate business school and had graduated with honors. As soon as he graduated, he began serving his mandatory military term in the Navy, just as Elder Joseph had. On that particular day, he was repairing some high-voltage electrical wires. Apparently something went wrong, and he was stunned by the electric current and thrown back into midair. Elder Joseph was informed of this during his prayer, as Nicholas was falling down to the ground from the high wires. He immediately rushed to his brother in Athens. Nicholas's right hand had been seriously hurt, and his right thumb had become almost useless. The accident was so serious that he was released from the Navy with a monthly pension of 80 drachmas. After he recovered, Nicholas transferred his pension to his cousins, who were orphans, and in the middle of 1933, at the age of 25, he went to the Holy Mountain to become a monk beside his brother, Elder Joseph. Less grace. When Yerenda left Athens, he returned to Gerovica, where he had already been for 2 years. In the meantime, 2 of his nuns had passed away, leaving only 3. Since the bishop continued to persecute them, they moved to Oranoupoli, which is right next to the Holy Mountain. There the nuns operated a mill to support themselves. When Yerenda was away from the Holy Mountain, he did not experience the same grace of Theoria he had when he was in the wilderness of the Holy Mountain. So he said to Father Arsenios, "What are we doing? We came to save people, to make nuns, and now, where is God? I have lost my God." Apparently being deprived of the fruits of Hesychas for so long pained him deeply. Later he would write, "As has been shown, I am only fit to guard the rocks, since I lack such a gift, and am unworthy to preach. Woe to me, the lowly old-timer. As I gather from the appearance of things, twice have I gone against the divine will out of ignorance. With what words shall I rebuke my wretched soul? In what way shall I implore my Lord? Or what work shall I do which will be pleasing to my God? Woe to me, the lowly one, for tears have dried up from my eyes." Thus he made the firm decision to return permanently to the wilderness of the Holy Mountain for which he longed so much. Since he couldn't just abandon his nuns, he said to them, "I won't be able to live with you anymore. I'm going to the Holy Mountain to live as an ascetic. You may continue your obedience to me, but we will communicate through letters." As it would turn out, their correspondence covered their spiritual needs completely. After living with their families for years, they all ended their lives in holiness.